Hello, genealogist. It's Craig from Just Genealogy. Today, I'd like to talk to you about Civil War prisoners of war. So, this is going to be a little bit longer than usual. My once a week, do it long kind of thing. We have lots of pictures from the Civil War, especially lots of pictures dealing with prisoners, hospitals, artillerists. We have 10 volumes of material that is in pictures. I'll show some of them to you at the end. But let's talk about POWs in the Civil War. So not long before the Civil War, there was the Mexican War, our first foreign war, the first time we went somewhere else. Although that's not exactly true from the perspective of there were members of the militia during the colonial times who went and fought at Cartagena and at Cuba, but that's for another day. During the Mexican War, they were not ready to deal with captured prisoners, and there was no single POW policy, and basically each field commander established his own policy. Scott and Taylor used an extensive use of paroles, but high-ranking officers, when recaptured, would be sent to the U.S., because they were violating their paroles. Parole basically means you've been captured and you agree not to fight again until you are exchanged, and these people were violating their paroles. So President Polk ordered an end of mass paroles. That meant they had to do something. Fortunately, there was a relatively small number of soldiers captured. There were almost immediate battlefield exchanges. And most parole violators, or some parole violators, didn't understand what parole meant. Yeah, that's unlikely. There were orders from political leadership to ignore paroles. That's more likely. And the Mexican government attempted to annul paroles, and that's very likely. So basically, a Mexican soldier would be paroled, and they'd just be told to go back and fight. So when it came time for the Civil War, basically nothing was learned from the Mexican War, and it wasn't that far in front of it. It started out with an impromptu system of parole and exchange, but it got overwhelmed very quickly by hundreds of thousands of POWs all of a sudden. By 1863, there were massive prison compounds all over the country. And the exchange programs would end when Grant came to be in charge of the Army, and basically Grant's process was that the South needs manpower. I'll fix it so the South doesn't have manpower. Capture everybody. Early on, Fort Delaware and Fort McHenry and Point Lookout were the prisons for Confederates. For the early Confederate prisons were in Richmond and Charleston. In 1862, the Union converted volunteer muster camps, in other words, recruit camps, mostly in the Midwest, Alton, Douglas, and Morton, Chase, into prisoner of war camps. And in 1862, there were parole camps at Camp Parole, which is outside of Annapolis, and Benton Barracks. There's a story early on in the war of Moultrie and Delaney Ball's Fairfax County Confederate cavalry, who actually didn't get the word to get out of Alexandria when the Army transport showed up from across the river, and they got captured. And nobody knew what to do with them. It was only April 21st, so it was very early in the war. And so they were sent to the Navy Yard, which is where the ships came from. The Army transports were docked there. And eventually, the commandant of the Navy Yard sends a telegram to Gideon Welles, who's the Secretary of the Navy, and says, "What am I supposed to do with these people?" And he sends a telegram back. Now, these people are only like 8 blocks apart. He sends a telegram back that says, "Hold on to them until I tell you otherwise." I've never been able to find the tell them otherwise part, but they eventually ended up in Capitol Prison and were eventually exchanged in October of the first year of the war. But it was just kind of funny that they thought they could run away on their horses and they couldn't, and nobody knew what to do with them. And finally they did something with them by putting them in Old Capitol Prison, and then eventually they got exchanged. So in this time, prison camps consisted of very poor shelter, inadequate food supplies, and little medical assistance. 674,000 prisoners were taken. 400,000 of them were incarcerated. 56,000 of them died in captivity, which is a higher mortality than on the battlefield. In 1862, in July, Lincoln authorized Major General John A. Dix to negotiate a general exchange of prisoners with the Confederate States of America. This was done through General Order number 142. And you can get to the cartel of July 22nd, 1862. And it basically talks about things like how you can exchange people, like a general commanding in chief or an admiral shall be exchanged for officers of equal rank or 60 privates or 60 common seamen. Master's mates in the Navy and lieutenants and ensigns in the Army shall be exchanged for officers of equal rank or 4 privates or 4 common seamen. So basically, they established the menu for what people were worth. There was also the issue that you could not exchange an Army guy for a Navy guy. It had to be Army, Army, Navy, Navy. You couldn't exchange a civilian for anything other than a civilian. There were pieces about all prisoners of war to be discharged on parole within 10 days after their capture, and the prisoners now held and those hereafter taken to be transported to the points mutually agreed. And in the East, that point was City Point outside of Richmond and Camp Parole outside of Annapolis. So basically what happened under this cartel was the groundwork was laid for how everybody was going to deal with prisoners. Eventually there will be William Hoffman, Brigadier General, who's the Commissary General of Prisoners for the Union, and Colonel Robert Ould, who is the Confederate agent for the exchange of prisoners, pretty much the same thing as General Hoffman. So these are the two guys that work it out, make it work so the prisoners move back and forth. Prisoners will be exchanged man for man and officer for officer, privateers to be placed on the footing of officers and men of the Navy. And you can see a captain of the Navy or a colonel should be exchanged for officers of equal rank or for 15 privates or a common seaman. It's nice to know what you're worth. If citizens held by either party on charges of disloyalty or alleged civil offense are exchanged, it shall only be for civilians. Captured sutlers, teamsters, and all civilians in the actual service of either party to be exchanged for persons in similar positions. So it's teamster for teamster, sutler for sutler. And then the surplus prisoners not exchanged shall not be permitted to take up arms again, nor to serve as military police or constabulary force in any fort, garrison, or fieldwork held by either of the respective parties, nor as guards of prisons, depots, or stores, nor to discharge any duty usually performed by soldiers until exchanged, under the provisions of this cartel. The exchange is not considered to be complete until the officer or soldier exchanged has been actually restored to the lines to which he belongs. Well, this, I guess, was just too easy. So in 1863, they adopted what is called the Lieber Code, or the Lieber Code. I don't know which it is. It was prepared by Francis, I would imagine that's Lieber, Francis Lieber, and revised by a board of officers of which General Hitchcock was president, and it was approved by the President of the United States. It had 157 articles. And if we look at some of those articles, you can see in exchanging prisoners of war, such numbers of persons of inferior rank may be substituted as an equivalent for one of superior rank as may be agreed upon by cartel, which requires the sanction of the government or the commander of the army in the field. So that told you who was in charge. one of the two. A prisoner of war is honor bound truly to state to the captor his rank. Yeah, it would be cheating if you could pretend to be a private. And he's not to assume a lower rank than belongs to him in order to cause a more advantageous exchange. Now, what officer would ever do that? Nor to claim to be a higher rank for the purpose of obtaining better treatment. In other words, an enlisted man saying he was an officer. And there was the opportunity to punish people who did this terrible kind of thing. In Section 108, it allowed surplus numbers of prisoners remaining after exchange to be released for payment of a stipulated sum of money or in urgent cases for provisions, clothing, and other necessities. Such arrangement, however, requires the sanction of highest authority. That would be the Army commander in the field. The exchange of prisoners isn't required. It's an act of convenience. If you haven't concluded a cartel following the battle, it cannot be demanded by either party. And we're just not required to exchange prisoners. This is what Grant did. He didn't exchange prisoners anymore. And a cartel is voidable as soon as either party has violated it. It's sort of like how our ceasefires today operate. No exchange of prisoners shall be made except after complete capture and after an accurate account of them and a list of captured officers has been taken. Therefore, I may have a picture in this stuff that shows people at I think it's the Battle of Aldie, lining up as POWs so they can be accounted for. So there were paddle wheel boats. This is the white flag, and it carried prisoners back and forth from City Point to Camp Parole and back and forth. So Confederates would come south. Union soldiers would go north out of the various prisons. Then we have something called Galvanized Yankees. Now, international law even then prohibits forced enlistment. But there's no provision against an enemy combatant who's been captured. There's no provision that prevents voluntary enlistment on the part of a POW to get out of prison. And these individuals would be subject to trial and execution if recaptured. Secretary of War Stanton prohibited the use of Confederates in the Union forces in February 1863. But there's a little workaround. 600 Confederates at Fort Delaware were sent west to fight Indians. And the only folk that they, in fact, would allow in the six volunteer regiments were those Confederates who have been drafted. So eventually, the way it works, 200 Irish Confederates from Camp Morton joined the 35th Indiana. In 1864, Lincoln authorizes recruitment of foreign-born prisoners at Rock Island for service in Pennsylvania regiments. Then the 6 U.S. volunteer regiments are formed. These have compiled military service records that are online at Fold 3. And these are Confederates who sign an oath of allegiance, and there's 6,000 of them, and they go west and fight Indians. So there's 6,000 in the U.S. volunteer regiments alone. There are 1,000 in each regiment. On the Confederate side, in 1864, 349 POWs enlisted from Camp Lawton, Georgia. In 1865, the 10th Tennessee Regiment is created with 192 men in January and 138 men in February. However, desertion exists in high numbers, and most men reported joining out of desperation. Only about 1,500 to 2,000 men total become galvanized Confederates rather than galvanized Yankees. But, in 10 times that number would actually become galvanized Yankees. So when we look at the compiled military service records, we can see the information dealing with POWs. It may be on a casualty list that demonstrates when they are captured. This is one for a James Scranton who's from a Connecticut unit. Here's a casualty sheet for him dying. It's the prison in Salisbury, North Carolina. Generally, a Union or Confederate compiled military service record will have a memorandum from prisoner of war records that will describe where they were captured, where they were a prisoner of war, and other information. What you want to pay attention to is what's in the upper right-hand corner, because that's where the information came from. So in this case, for Scranton, the information came from muster rolls, and here you can see the 2 muster rolls that it came from. You may also find medical records in the record. These definitely would exist in Confederate records. The carded medical records for Union are separate, but the carded medical records for Confederates are not. They're part of the compiled military service record. But here is Daniel Lynch from a Connecticut unit, and this is one of the few places where you can find next of kin information. Unfortunately, in this case, her name is Mrs. Lynch. It's his mother, and she lives at 17 Trafalgar Square. Been there, couldn't find it. Walked all around Trafalgar Square trying to find where Mrs. Lynch lived. So the compiled military service records, let's look at one of them. This is Samuel S. Robinson. He served with the 16th North Carolina Infantry. The reason that I know about Sam is because I had a friend in Charlotte who descended from Sam, and Sam was at Point Lookout, and Sam died at Point Lookout, and Sam was in the mass grave at Point Lookout. So that meant that he could get a VA tombstone wherever the family wanted to have it put. We also researched Sam rather completely and found he had a little bit of gold on account, wrote a letter to the government asking for that gold, and the government said they weren't responsible for keeping records that long, so they couldn't help us. I told him not to pursue it any farther. It wouldn't be worth it. But they did get the VA headstone. This 300-pound piece of rock ended up in their driveway one year. They threw it in the back of the station wagon and took it up top of the hill, not far from them, where his wife Sarah was buried, and they put that tombstone in the ground. I wish that they could have carved on the back of it cenotaph so that everybody would know that old Sam wasn't buried there, that he was in the mass grave at Point Lookout, but that's a different story. So if we look at his compiled military service record, here he is in Company C, 16th North Carolina Infantry. And when we look at the pieces of the compiled military service record, we can see him being in a hospital. We can see where he mustered in. And we can see that he's absent sick, and he's absent missing in action on the 23rd of 1864. Well, you go to books that deal with the Civil War day by day, and you can figure out exactly what was happening to the 16th Virginia Regiment on the 23rd of May. Basically, it's the Battle of Henrico Junction, the Battle of Lake Anna, depending on whose side you're on. We also learned here that he was a musician, and we see where he dies at Point Lookout, August 24th, 1864. He dies of urosyphilis, according to the register. Not a good thing to die from. So when you look at the E.B. Long's book, The Day by Day, Civil War Day by Day, it says the North Anna River, 23-27, May 1864, also known as Hanover Junction, Jericho Mills, Ford Ore Bridge, Taylor's Bridge, and basically it talks a little bit about the battle. And you can pretty much, with maps and that kind of stuff, know exactly where old Sam got captured in the railroad track, by the railroad tracks is where it actually happened. Now there are selected records for the War Department relating to Confederate prisoners of war on Ancestry, which deal with 427 bound volumes of records relating to Confederate prisoners of war confined by federal authorities during the war. 2 of the volumes extend into 1866. If you're a prisoner of war in 1866, it's only because you are too sick to travel, and they're trying to get you better. There are records in Record Group 109. This is the War Department collection of Confederate records that deal with prisoners, oaths, and paroles, all kinds of things. And this information comes from the Guide to the Federal Records, so you can get to it on archives.gov. There is an online roll list for the material that's available on Ancestry. However, that online roll list is also in the first roll on Ancestry in the very beginning as part of the introduction. So you always want to go, whenever you're dealing with microfilm, and go look at the first roll in the front and take a look at the descriptive pamphlet, or go to archives.gov and download the descriptive pamphlet. Now, there are records of individual prisons and stations, and they're arranged alphabetically by name of the military prison or other place of confinement. That's what this roll list is all about. And it talks about what registers there are. So for each prison or station, there might be 3 main types of records. Those compiled by the Office of the Commissary General of Prisoners, general ledgers, and auxiliary ledgers. So the general ledger would have arrivals, confinements, disposition of prisoners. There are several types of auxiliary registers. There are prisoners confined, those who died, just regular lists, ledgers like where Sam's gold is, morning reports, and various other records. So for Point Lookout, where Sam was, we can see that we have letters, we have General Register of Prisoners, we have Register of Prisoners, we have prisoners transferred from Point Lookout, prisoners transferred from Hammond General Hospital, and the disposition of prisoners. Hammond General Hospital was the Point Lookout General Hospital, there in the prisoner of war camp, or next to the prisoner of war camp. And then registers of prisoners exchanged, paroled, and released, and of prisoners taking oaths of allegiance, and list of prisoners released for employment on public works, 1864 to 1865. There also are registers and lists of prisoners enlisted in the United States service, and of valuables and money belonging to prisoners, and listed prisoners transferred, again, to Hammond General Hospital. List of money and property of prisoners. This is where Sam's money was. Registers of letters and packages received for and delivered to prisoners. Ledgers of prisoners' accounts with a name index, and register of letters received. So when we look at these, you can see that by looking at the finding aid for Record Group 109, the War Department collection of Confederate records, you can read about each one of these kinds of registers that you can find. Now, there also is a register of Confederate soldiers, sailors, and citizens who died in federal prisons and military hospitals. And it has appeared in various ways over the years. It's been published as a book. It's been on CD. It's on Ancestry. And here's the page that Sam is on. And he's the second person on the list. And this shows that he's buried in the Confederate cemetery there at Point Lookout. And it happens to be a mass grave. Now, what is parole? Parole's your word of honor, especially that if we let you go, you will not engage in combat until you are exchanged. So there are parole registers, and prisoners can be paroled after taking the oath of allegiance. That means they're not going to be exchanged. They just get to go home. And there are rolls, reports, and returns related to arrival and disposition of paroled federal prisoners. So these are as they move from place to place. So if we look at North Carolina paroled, there is a microfilm publication, 7 rolls, comes out of Record Group 109, and it's muster rolls and lists of Confederate troops paroled in North Carolina. And there's a descriptive pamphlet of it. There also is the concept of exchange, and this is where a soldier is now free from either prison or his parole and allows him to return to duty in a military capacity, and there are exchange registers. Now, one of the interesting concepts that's happening during the war is the Adams Telegraph Company. They're doing telegraphs for both sides. It's really an interesting phenomenon. Eventually, Grant will create his own telegraph organization because he doesn't trust Adams. This is Samuel Brock. He's a prisoner of war at Rock Island Barracks in 1864, and someone has sent him $30. So in the records of Rock Island Barracks, there are receipts for these dollars. Now, why didn't Sam get it? Sam was dead. So a letter was sent from home with $30 in it to Sam, telling him pretty much to buy a winter coat. But by the time the letter got to Rock Island, Samuel Brock was already deceased. So the government just pocketed that $30 and provided a receipt in the file, and that was it. The letter is in the records of the Rock Island prisoner of war camp and not online. So there are official records, correspondence, orders, reports, returns, Union and Confederate, relating to prisoners of war. And so far as the military authorities were concerned, that also dealt with state and political prisoners. For example, a lot of individuals from Northern Virginia and the District of Columbia and Maryland, civilians, would end up in prison because of their sympathy. So in the official records, there are 8 volumes that deal with prisoners of war, and you can get to these online through Haiti Trust. If we go to Record Group 393, Records of the United States Army Continental Commands, we find records that deal with prisoners of war camps. So Camp Banks, Carroll Prison, Forest Hall Prison, Oddfellows Hall Prison, various prisons in the system. The records are found in Record Group 393. Now there also are Corps prisons, Army Corps prisons. In other words, this is who administered these prisons, was the 21st Army Corps in 1863. There are records, in 393, there are records of miscellaneous Civil War installations. And you can see by looking here, there are recruit camps, camps of instruction, convalescent camps and barracks. These are where Veteran Reserve Corps people are going to start out. Camps of distribution, this is where the recruits will be sent for distribution to units. Invalid camps, again, Veteran Reserve Corps. Parole camp waiting to be exchanged. Remember, there's the one, Camp Parole, outside of Annapolis. Other camps, defenses, cavalry depots and depot camps. Records of hospitals, and then records of prisons. And then later on, records of soldiers' homes and rests. So if we look at the records of the parole camps, you can find these there. And there are various parole camps, but eventually everyone is going to end up at Camp Parole, or they're going to end up back with their unit once they are exchanged. So there are records of several prisons, and again, you can get to this through the Guide to the Federal Records as to which specific prisons they do have. And here's a picture of a Petersburg tobacco factory that was used as a prison. This is Castle Thunder in 1865. Then there is the records of the Commissary General of Prisoners. Remember General Hoffman, these are his records. This is Record Group 249, and there's a finding aid available for it also. And it talks about, the Guide to the Federal Records talks about its establishment and what its actual function was. It has an administrative history like every record group in the National Archives. It talks about Hoffman. It talks about what records exist for POWs. And one of the interesting things is the roles of federal prisoners of war who enlisted in the Confederate Army. Not a good thing to have happen since the Confederates didn't win. There are the records of Andersonville, which were on microfilm, and they're in Record Group 249. So basically what you have is Confederate records are in 109, Union records are in 249. 249 is not well organized. Here is a list of paroles from a regiment captured at Richmond, Kentucky, or various regiments captured at various companies of various regiments captured at Richmond, Kentucky. Then there are miscellaneous records, and this is where you would find information on the steamer Sultana. At some point, I'll talk about the Sultana because we have books on it, and we've been able to track a bunch of people down, and there's a history and all that kind of stuff. So this is where those records will originally be found in entry 98, and they're arranged by type of record, and there's 10 inches. Because they were microfilmed, those records are also going to be found on fold 3, or at least a portion of them. You never know when something is microfilmed. If they microfilmed everything, and I'm never sure whether everything has been microfilmed or not. Many times I'm told I can't look at something because it's been microfilmed, and I demonstrate that what I'm looking for is in that series of records, but it's not on the microfilm, and I'm able to look at it. So that's part of the problem. There are records relating to individual federal prisoners of war for various prisons. Registers for those who escaped from Confederate authorities and those who escaped from Confederate prisons. Then there are the records of Benton Barracks. Remember, Benton Barracks is the parole camp in the West. There are records of Camp Chase, and these are individuals who are deserters and stragglers. In other words, these actually are Union people who they're putting in prison. The College Green Barracks in Maryland, that's associated with Camp Parole outside of Annapolis, and as are the records of Camp Parole itself. So here, entry 193 is a list of paroled federal prisoners of war from the 2nd Indiana and 11th Kentucky Cavalry Regiments captured at Hartsville, Tennessee on December 7th, 1862. These are various registers. There's an appendix which lists miscellaneous rolls, returns, and reports. It's entry 107. And you can find all kinds of lists of paroled prisoners forwarded from Elmira, New York to Camp Parole, Maryland, 17 July 1863. So these are Confederate prisoners of war who have been paroled or are being sent to Camp Parole to end up on a paddle boat to go back to City Point and rejoin the Confederacy. Then entry 996 of entry 107 is a list of federal prisoners at Richmond in 1862. The material that deals with the Galvanized Yankees is also here in entry 401. I don't do much with that entry so much as I do with the individual compiled military service records, because those are easier to get to, but eventually I'll go look at this. So there is a photographic history. Volume 7 deals with prisons and hospitals. And very quickly, I will just show you some of the pictures and the quality of the pictures that are here. These are men at Fort Delaware. These are New Yorkers of the Fighting 69th in Charleston. She's a Confederate spy, and that's why she's in prison. These are the non-commissioned officers of the 19th Iowa at New Orleans. This is a picture of Camp Elmira. It's New York. Doesn't it look nice? Nice and cold in the wintertime. Most of the people in Elmira came up from Point Lookout when they shut Point Lookout down. This is folk at Point Lookout. And remember I told you I would show you a set of Confederate folks captured at Aldie. Well, this is them. This is them lining up to be sent off to POW camp. In epilogue to all this, 21 July 1865, Hoffman orders POWs freed except for those captured with Davis, and those held for special reasons. They're given an oath of allegiance, and they're given parole. The last 15 to be released are 4 privates too sick to travel, a convicted spy, Jefferson Davis, and 2 personal aides, the Secretary of the Navy, Stephen A. Mallory, and Henry Wirtz. Though all those people will be released except for Henry Wirtz, he'll be hung. He's the only war criminal to be actually punished in the entire Civil War after the end of the war. So this has been Craig with Just Genealogy, not so quickly going over prisoner of war records. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. If you'd like me to see if I can track down a Confederate Union prisoner of war that you've had difficulty with, let me know in the comments also. And I will see you tomorrow.